past the clouds, over the dark night. She reached up to the sky of stars and caught the red-hot light of the North Star.
Greetings, and as always, welcome back. On Saturday, the 6th of July, the leaders of the 11 largest emerging economies signed the joint declaration of the 17th BRICS Summit in Rio de Janeiro. At the summit, BRICS member countries reaffirmed their commitment to multilateralism and to defending international law, including the purposes and principles enshrined in the UN Charter. The document also calls for the increased participation of developing countries, particularly those in Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, in global decision-making processes and structures. Wow. All of those points sound commendable and worth pursuing. Why is Donald Trump and why are other world leaders so concerned about BRICS? Let's connect some dots and find out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.
Welcome to the Connecting the Dots podcast with Dr. Wilmer Leon, and I am Wilmer Leon. You know, with each show, my guests and I provide insight and analysis into current events and the broader historical context in which most of these events take place. Let's quickly look at some of today's headlines. Earlier today, Foreign Secretary Lavrov and Secretary of State Rubio held a bilateral meeting at the Asian sidelines in Malaysia. The meeting took place of the Asian conference and lasted for 50 minutes. Rubio said he expressed to Lavrov what the U.S. President Trump has said publicly, that there's not been any more flexibility on the Russian side to bring about an end to this conflict. One can only hope at some point, Lil Marco and Trump will come to the realization you won't bully or scare Russia into submission. The U.S. started the fight. The U.S. is losing the fight. The U.S. will never win the fight. Stop reading your own press clippings, Lil Marco, and get down to surrendering. That's how this fiasco is going to end. China may ask Russia to attack NATO if Taiwan is invaded, according to Reuters. If China attacks Taiwan, China attacks Taiwan, Beijing may ask Moscow to open a second front against NATO states. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte said in an interview with the New York Times, published last week, quote, "There is an increasing realization, and let's not be naive about this. If Xi Jinping would attack Taiwan, he would first make sure that he makes a call to his very junior partner in all of this, Vladimir Putin, residing in Moscow, and telling him, quote, hey, I'm going to do this, and I need you to keep them busy in Europe by attacking NATO territory, end quote, according to Rutte. Folks, China's not going to attack Taiwan. That would be analogous to the United States attacking Puerto Rico. Not going to happen. It's not in the cards. It's not in the cereal. It's not on the wall. So all of this is just more rhetoric and more hyperbole, more jingoism to justify these foolish pursuits of the U.S. in the Pacific. Finally, Federal judge places new block on Trump's ban on birthright citizenship. Judge Joseph LaPlante said he would issue the temporary injunction after agreeing to certify a class action lawsuit against the administration on behalf of U.S.-born children or future children. A federal judge in New Hampshire today placed a new nationwide block on Trump's efforts to end birthright citizenship, a decision that came 2 weeks after the U.S. Supreme Court opened a path for the administration to begin enforcing the order. Folks, the 14th Amendment citizenship clause in Section 1 specifically states, quote, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside, end quote. That's in the Constitution, folks. Somebody needs to call Donald Trump and let him know that would require an amendment to the Constitution that can only come through Congress or a constitutional convention. With that said, okay, on today's episode, the issue before us is the 2025 BRICS Summit was the 17th annual, held in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, on the 6th and 7th of July. What is BRICS? Is it relevant? Is BRICS, as Trump claims, pushing to undermine the U.S. dollar's dominance and threatening America's economic supremacy? My guest is a Latin America-based media maker and the former director of video production for Telesur English, and covered the 2025 BRICS Summit in Rio, Michael Fox. Mike, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
I really appreciate you joining me today. And let's start with a very simple question for those that have probably heard the acronym but don't really understand what BRICS is. Please explain, please enlighten, what is BRICS, BRICS?
Right. So BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. It's a trade bloc that was started in 2009, but actually the idea from it came originally from an economist who said these are the best developing countries to invest in. Back 10 years before, it was called the RIC at the moment, but they added Brazil, and then South Africa joined in 2011. And the idea is it's a counter-hegemonic trade group that says, look, we don't want the United States and the EU and the European unions and the Western countries to rule everything. We want things to be more horizontal. We want things to be more communal. And so let's build this block together to kind of push our agenda. And of course, those countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, are kind of like the most powerful economies, developing economies in the world. Now, just last year, they added another 6 countries, including Egypt, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates. And then Saudi Arabia is kind of wishy-washy, maybe might join, maybe not. So they just added those countries. And then you had, just over the last year, a new 10 associate countries. So literally at this meeting, you had 26 different countries. So you had the 11 countries from the BRICS, and then you have the 10 associate countries, and that includes Bolivia, Cuba, but then Turkey, Malaysia, Vietnam, Algeria, Kazakhstan, Uganda, Nigeria. So like way more other countries. And then they also brought in a bunch of observer countries, including Chile, Colombia, who else? Mexico and Uruguay, many of them the largest economies in South America. The whole idea, or in Latin America, the whole idea is, listen, we want a huge swath of the developing countries around the world to come together so we can all be in discussing issues around what's important for our nations, around trade, about finance, politics, policies, health, climate change, education. And so like, how do we, develop these ideas from the global South, from the developing countries, and to then push our agenda in the world instead of just, bowing down to the G7 as, so much of the country, so much of the world has always had to do.
One of our listeners, Peggy Parks Miller, and a member of the Connecting the Dots Club, just made the point here, and I think this is a great analogy. Non-alignment movement, Bandung Conference, 1955 is the influence. Peggy, great point.
This is actually, it's so good, Peggy, that you brought this up, because actually Lula mentioned this on the very first, he had a 10-minute like speech on the very first day where he kind of kicked the summit off. And that's what he said. We are the heirs of the non-aligned movement. And this is so important to understand what the BRICS means today, because there is no other group in the world. And this thing even for me, that I had heard the BRICS, I'd understand this, but being in the conference and speaking to people about this over the last week, you really got this sense of, wow, this is the leading group on the planet that's pushing to challenge the hegemony of the United States and the EU and the G7, to reform the United Nations and global governance at a moment in which the UN is completely paralyzed. And so this is the group, and it is absolutely the legacy is absolutely the non-aligned movement. Thank you, Peggy.
You know, and a real-time example of this, and I think this is accurate. If you think back to when the United States during the Biden administration first started trying to pick this fight with Russia through Ukraine, and Joe Biden told us, quote, "We're going to turn the ruble into rubble," end quote. And Biden's tactic for doing that was cutting Russia out of the SWIFT system. And for those that don't know, the SWIFT system is the international, think of it as the ATM, the international ATM machine. All trades go through SWIFT in dollars. And so Biden figured, well, if I cut Russia off of the ATM, when Putin goes to put his card in, it'll come back declined. The economy will crumble. There will be havoc in the streets of Russia, and they'll run Putin out of Russia on a rail. Well, what Putin did was he said, minor problem. Let's just start trading in our own currencies. We don't need the SWIFT system. I know that's a very simplistic explanation, but I think it is factual. So your thoughts, Mike, is that an accurate description so that those that still may not grasp BRICS, this is why BRICS basically was created? That's this kind of leverage.
Absolutely. And that's one facet of it. But that, you brought up Putin. And in fact, he spoke via live stream to the conference. He wasn't there because of the ICC order out for his arrest. He couldn't travel. But that was his big thing. We need to de-dollarize, and we need to be trading in local currencies. It's really not that hard, right? Look, you're this, you got this currency, let's trade in local currency. But the United States has ruled the currency system. And many people believe that Trump really lashed out at the BRICS countries on Sunday night. So the conference went on from Sunday into Monday. They released the final declaration actually on Sunday afternoon. So it was already out even before the final day of the conference. But Trump, by that night at 11:24, he posted on Truth Social, basically saying, you BRICS countries who are pushing an anti-American agenda, if you do this and if you're aligned with the BRICS, you're going to automatically get a 10% tariff from the United States tossed on top of you. So he did that on Sunday night in response very clearly to kind of what they were discussing. Now, in the declaration, in the leaders' declaration that came out, there were 126 different resolutions. There was no mention of the United States, clearly. There's no mention of specific countries like that. But they clearly rejected individualistic protectionist measures like the United States has been doing with the tariffs. Of course, condemned the genocide and the attack on Gaza, and also the attack on Iran. So they're very clearly pushing back on the US, even though they weren't mentioning the US. But the question of the de-dollarization was huge. And they mentioned it several times. They didn't say de-dollarization. They said, we're going to work toward using local currencies in our trades, and also in the new development bank, which is the bank from the BRICS, which it actually had its 10th anniversary, that had a big conference on it just before the summit. They want to move that into local currencies. Currently, like you mentioned, roughly 50% of international trade, international exchanges are done, more than 50% are done in dollars. The BRICS is huge. We're talking about, if you include all the countries that were there just over this last weekend, it's roughly half the population in the world. So it's a huge percentage of the amount of trade and exchange that are going on. And if they actually move in that direction, which they're going to, then we're going to see a big change, and it's going to be a big hit to Trump in the United States. Just one more thing to mention, Wilmer. The day after, or just a couple days after Trump's election in November, and then he reiterated the same thing right after his inauguration. He said, look, those countries that are pushing for de-dollarization are going to get 100% tariff on their heads. So this is his thing. He does not want the countries of the world to move away from the dollar. Obviously, that's going to hit the U.S. currency hard. What's so crazy, Wilmer, is the fact that here you have a person, the harder he pushes against these countries, the more they're just going to turn the other way. They're going to turn the other cheek and go, look, we've got each other. Like, let's create new systems. Let's do this. So it's like, it's asinine.
Point. That's the important point here, is Donald Trump plays this as though the BRICS countries and the observers are taking an aggressive, offensive attack. No, this is reactionary. This is countries saying we're tired. This is somebody standing up to the bully in the bar saying, I'm not going to let you punch me in the face again. I'm going to hit you back. And then the bully says, why are you attacking me? I'm the bully. I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. No, what I'm supposed to do is punch you in your throat and defend myself.
Yeah, no, it's shocking. That is absolutely what's going on. And that's why it's so exciting to see all these countries together. I mean, it was a really exciting event. It was fascinating to be there just personally, as you're in this huge auditorium with all the rest of the press. We couldn't actually access the location where the event was taking place. We were kind of just beside it. We could take images down when people were arriving. We could do our lives, and then we would get like the live stream from the inside of the event. So it was funny in that sense. But still, just being in that space and with journalists from dozens of countries around the world, this is a big deal. It's a very big deal, even if most people in the United States have never heard about this or aren't hearing about it at all. And this event, more than ever before, and I think this is really important, Wilmer, Lula said at the very beginning, he says, this event has never been more important because it's happening in this moment of just utter chaos in the world, when the UN is paralyzed, when multinational governments is just failing, when we're seeing genocide and war happening all around us, and it's increasing. And it's a clear sign that now more than ever, the BRICS are important. And I think that was really powerful to start to kick everything off with.
Well, and let me go back to this from my open. They're calling for increased participation of developing countries, particularly those in Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, in the global decision-making process and structures. And they're enshrining the principles in the UN Charter, and they're defending international law. Why is that a problem?
It's a problem because Donald Trump wants it to be about himself, and the United States and the EU want it to be about themselves. And so when you're talking about greater democratization and greater changes from below, they see their own interests being impacted and affected. I mean, one of the big things they talked about was the reorganization, the revamping of the UN. Lula talked about this often throughout the weekend. That the UN Security Council, why is it that we have 5 countries that have veto power within the UN Security Council? It's a legacy of 80 years ago when the UN was founded. And okay, these are the 5 countries that we need. These are the most powerful, whatever. Look, things have got to change because it's clearly not working. A genocide can be happening. It's colonialism, and a genocide can be happening in on the other side of the planet, and no one is doing anything to stop it. And so Lula says, well, why can't Nigeria be in the UN Security Council? Why can't Brazil be there? Why can't Ethiopia or any other countries around the world? Why can't this be democratized in a way that actually represents the world today? That's really powerful, because I don't hear enough people talking about, the reform of the UN, particularly not in the United States. That's just like, oh, that's just the way it is, and yet that was something that they're really pushing. They're really pushing that agenda, just in particular about the UN, but on so many other issues.
I want to frame this question properly. You look at BRICS and you look at the development of BRICS, and then you juxtapose that to the G7 or what could revert back to the G8 if they allow Russia back in. Some would say if you look at the trajectory of change, and we're moving from a unipolar to a multipolar dynamic, that actually the G7 is on the wane and BRICS is on the rise.
That is what the developing countries, that's what the countries that were in Rio de Janeiro this last weekend absolutely want. And that's why I'd say way the majority of the countries in the world would like. Now, if you look at the G7 countries, they want to keep their power. But absolutely, things are changing on the planet. And things are changing the world, and that's the direction that we need to be headed. And that's direction that was very clear. That was very clear this weekend. There's no doubt that I guess the big question in my mind is how much of a pushback are we going to be seeing from the United States, the European countries, the G7, and things like that.
And how is that pushback going to manifest itself?
Right. Exactly. And this is one of the things, obviously, that's why Donald Trump is tweeting this out. That's why he tweeted out, or not tweeted out, Truth Socialed out. That's why he posted earlier this year about the 100% tariffs and then the 10% tariffs. Like, he's getting angry and he wants to push back. What's so fascinating here is we have the other countries coming together and saying, you know what, do whatever you want to do. Here, the one really important thing that was very clear this last weekend that I want to touch on, and it also highlights this massive difference between the G7 and the BRICS, is you had the 2 days before the official summit of the presidents, you had this popular council. Now, this was created by Russia this last year and then implemented over the last year. So all the different countries that are involved, but particularly like the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, those countries in particular, they were involved in kind of deliberations, but at a grassroots level. So you had social movements, academics, people from civil society who came together and created their own recommendations and suggestions for the BRICS leaders. So they did that over many, many different meetings. And then there was a whole popular council forum that lasted for 2 days that I attended, in which they then brought that on the first day of the summit, they brought those recommendations to the leaders. You don't see this. Can you imagine this at the G7, the MST, the Landless Workers Movement, thinking about how we can develop different policies and what's important in the world and why we have to stop hunger and, agriculture, whatever. Can you imagine like the MST involved in bringing recommendations to the G7 leaders? It's not going to happen. But here, the BRICS, they opened this space for this. And so people in the grassroots, and you had a lot of participation. I was actually really impressed because participants from homeless movements, labor movements, the MST, which is, of course, it's the largest social movement in the Americas. Over 1.5 million people have won land through the Landless Workers Movement over the last 20 years. I mean, it's huge. And so their participation, plus these academics and everybody coming together and speaking about what they want, but on a grassroots level, this shows this kind of horizontalism that is really important within the BRICS, and that they're really trying to foment more and more. And I think that was that's something that almost nobody's talking about in the mainstream press, and something that is really important to highlight because it underscores kind of the makeup of the BRICS, and particularly the makeup of where the BRICS want to go in terms of being able to reach out to civil society and hear from grassroots. It's not just the whole idea is breaking the whole hierarchy. That's something that many people within that popular forum we're talking about, is what they like about the BRICS is this horizontalism. I'm not here to tell you other country, what you're supposed to believe. I'm not going to arm wrestle you to try and approve some sort of thing that I want you to approve. Like, let's come together and let's negotiate. They have these negotiators. They're called Sherpas in the BRICS terminology. And they did something like 300 meetings from last year to this year to get to that final declaration. And the whole idea is consensus. We're going to come together and we want to bring everybody on board. That's powerful. We don't see that in the G7, where everybody's like pushing everybody else, telling everybody else what they have to do. This is very, very different.
Kevin Baptiste, thank you for that $5 super sticker, particularly after your great contribution yesterday. U.S. can have BRICS in a position of economic and political sovereignty. Great point, Kevin, but I think that train has already left the station, which is why Donald Trump, and I know it's almost reflective to refer to this as Trump. This isn't Trump. Trump is not the causation. He's the culmination. He's merely the current spokesperson or the face on U.S. hegemony. But with that being said, I think that train has left the station. BRICS is sovereign, which is why the United States and the G7 and others are so afraid of it.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I think what's interesting about Donald Trump is he is obviously at the head of this. He's not the one who's creating this. BRICS has been around for a long time. He just happens to be there right now. But he's making it so much worse because of his antagonism. It's then pushing those countries away. And then they're responding by saying, look, if you want to make stupid tweets, this was Lula's response to Trump's tweet. First off, you know what? I shouldn't even respond to this. This was during the press conference on Monday, right after the summit was done, with a bunch of journalists that were in the room. And the first three questions, it was fascinating because every journalist was in the room. This was the question they wanted to ask. This is how Trump attracts all the attention and derails the conversation from anything else. Because we were literally there for 2 days talking about BRICS. Trump sends 2 posts on True Social, and then all the first questions during the press conference with Lula are about Trump and are about, BRICS' possible response to Trump. But so Lula responds, first off, I shouldn't even respond. I shouldn't have to respond to this. This is just stupid. It's ridiculous. But then he says, look, we don't need emperors. We are sovereign nations. Like you said, that train has left the station. We're on a different path now. And basically he said, look, this is what he can do, whatever he wants to, and we're going to do what we're going to do. But we don't have to respond as a bloc. And in fact, what he said is the countries that were here at BRICS, we didn't mention Trump's threat of tariffs once. It didn't come up. We're doing our thing. Trump can make all his ugly schoolyard bully comments that he wants to. We're gonna do our thing. And that's the piece that Trump, and I'm trying to understand from a Trump perspective, like, what is he trying to get at? Maybe he feels like he has to do this, but like the more he pushes people away, the more it's going to unite other people against him and against the United States.
You're trying to figure out Donald Trump logic?
No, not that. Just the post. I'm like, really?
How drunk do you need to be? Is that tequila in that mug? You got to be flat out tripping to try to. Okay. Anyway, one of the things that I took away from those tweets, those threats about tariffs, is why. And this is to me a huge part of the colonial mindset.
Yeah.
Why is my being pro me always misinterpreted as being anti you? Why can't I just be pro me? And why can't we peacefully coexist? But as soon as BRICS, the BRICS countries start talking about trading in their own currencies, because of the United States stealing gold from the Venezuelan sovereign fund, because the United States stealing money from the Russian sovereign fund, there has to be some reaction to that. You can't just let the guy come into your living room, pull a pistol, and take your stereo. No, you got to pull your own pistol. So this whole thing is those countries being pro them gets misinterpreted into being anti-US.
Wilmer, that's such a great point. And that was so clear because he said the anti-American BRICS. That was the phrase he used. There was no mention of the United States once. They said, what we want is equality and democracy, right? And we want a horizontal global governance system. And frankly, we don't want protectionist unilateral policies. That's not good for us. And frankly, we don't support genocide in Gaza, nor do we support people invading Iran. Sorry. And then Trump responds to that with anti-American. It is fascinating. It is fascinating though when you think about it. Just the fact that people have for the last 80 years been largely trading on the international sphere with the US dollar. The moment that people start saying, you know what, let's use some other currencies, that's seen as anti-American. When you shift to your own currency, that's seen as, oh, now you're against the United States. Why? Because we're not going to use the dollar to trade. Like that's insane.
And this is simplistic, if not sophomoric, but I think it needs to be stated. Why would a country want to trade in its own currency?
So, Wilmer,
this is strengthen its own economy.
Exactly. And this is so important. The whole reason why the US dollar, what's the US debt right now? I have no idea. It's trillions and trillions. But the whole reason why the United States is able to have its debt like that is because everyone uses the dollars in reserves, right? It's that dollar is going to remain strong. And that's why Trump is afraid, because you trade in your own currency. It's good for you. You trade in your friend's currency. It's good for them. And once you start pulling your money out of the dollars, it's not so good for the United States. It's not so good for the US economy because they're losing strength, right?
You mentioned the landless workers union, and that brought to mind land reform. When you look at Zimbabwe and the agreement, the Lancaster House agreement that was reached between Robert Mugabe and I think it was what's the woman's name that was the prime minister in England at the time? Margaret Thatcher. I think it was Mugabe and Thatcher backed by Jimmy Carter, backed by the United States. What was that supposed to result in? That was supposed to result in the peaceful transference of black Zimbabwean land back from the British settlers back to the black Zimbabweans at a fair price. Then you go to South Africa and the current what's it called? Fair offer, fair exchange. That's not it, but that's close. The policy in South Africa where so much of that agricultural Boer controlled former black South African land transferred back to, but in the Trump administration and in previous America, you can't have that. That's land. They're stealing land. They're, so you're mentioning the landless workers union just made me think about this whole land reform issue and how so many of the former colonial states or colonial countries are so opposed. And then we can go into so many of the South and Central American countries back in the 50s and the 60s that were where land reform was being implemented, and the United Fruit Company says, no, you can't do that. Your thoughts?
Absolutely. Well, see, that's the old. That is the U.S. colonial system, right? That's U.S. imperialism at its best, intervention that we've seen for the last 200, 300, 500, 600, whatever, however many years. And I think this is so important because if you look at the way that the United States has historically treated so many other countries, speaking about Central America and South America, for instance, with the so-called banana republics, we're just gonna, if we don't like the president, we're gonna take you out. Arbenz, whoever else, we're gonna take you out. We don't like Allende in Chile, we're gonna take you out. We're gonna impose our own people. This is exactly what the BRICS nations are trying to get away from. It's this basic, this question of sovereignty. Like, you might not like my country, you might not like my government, you might not like the way, like the election, the vote that we did, but we treat each other as sovereign nations who can then work together and, develop our own policies and our own goals and try and work together on an equal playing field. Whereas in the United States, I can't remember if the quote was from Nixon, like, we can't let the Chileans vote wrong when they voted in Allende, so we need to fix it for them. That was essentially, it might have been Kissinger, but still, like, that's the idea. These are two completely different visions for the world. One is top down, completely hegemonic, completely, I am going to force you to do what I want to happen, and the other one is horizontal on a different level.
You use the word sovereign, and that is a term that we hear all the time, but I don't know that people really understand what that term means. And very simply, it's the internationally recognized ability of a government to govern in a geographically defined space and to use military means to defend itself. And Trump will use the word sovereign. Biden used the word sovereign. The United States loves to talk about respecting sovereignty as it went into Ukraine in 2014 and overthrew its democratically elected government, as it's trying to get rid of Maduro, tried to impose Juan Guaido on the Venezuelan people, as Venezuela is a sovereign nation. And the hypocrisy in all of that is nauseating.
Oh yeah, and this is the history of the United States, also, right? This is the history of the. So I finished a podcast a couple years ago called Under the Shadow, in which I traveled through Central America, went to places of U.S. intervention throughout, and then looked at the legacy of what that means today. And I'm specifically looking at the 1980s, right, in Central America. The United States role was just devastating, right? Invading, like, there was no sovereignty for any of these countries. It was the United States. And even in the case of, for instance, when Nicaragua and the Sandinistas, won their revolution, the United States was then funding the Contras in Honduras and different countries to then invade and destroy any possible. So this is like the legacy and the history of what the U.S. represents, particularly in Latin America, and has represented for the last 200 years. And this is absolutely a really important point for people in the U.S., people anywhere, but particularly people in the U.S. to understand, because, like you said, it's thrown around like, oh, you're sovereign, freedom, whatever, but like, we don't get to the nitty gritty of, like, these countries are sovereign. And this is something, Wilbur, I think this is important because many people at the BRICS summit talked about that. And in fact, one analyst that I spoke with from the BRICS Policy Center, she said, look, these countries aren't necessarily aligned politically when we're talking about these 20 or 26 countries. This isn't like the ALBA countries in Latin America that are, all like the Venezuela and Cuba and Bolivia and Ecuador at its time, right? Where they're all united politically with a very, very specific vision. Some of the countries are conservative. Some of the countries are on the left. Some of the countries are on the right. Some of the countries aren't so democratic. Other ones are more democratic. But the whole idea of the BRICS is, we're not going to get into your domestic policies. I'm not going to haggle with you over what I think you should do. That's not my business, really. But what we're going to do is find a way to trade and to negotiate and to deal with each other on an international level. This is a different style of international relations. Like, Trump is all about the only three countries, the three presidents from Latin America who came to his inauguration were Milei from Argentina, was Noboa from Daniel Noboa from Ecuador, and Nayib Bukele from El Salvador. These are the three leading far-right presidents of Latin America. No one else was invited. That is a clear sign.
Of the United States.
Clearly puppets of the United States, absolutely. And that is an absolute sign that this is not what Trump is going for. He's going for ideology. He's going for he wants his politics and his policies pushed abroad. And you know what? If you're not on board, then get out of the way.
I want to read this brief paragraph from a Ukrainian newspaper. So consider the source. But I want to get your, since you were there, I want to get your take on this. BRICS Summit 2025 in Brazil was a failure for Putin. Details from the National Security and Defense Council. Russian dictator Putin did not come to Brazil because he was afraid of arrest. Chinese leader Xi did not even try to pretend that he was interested. And the pro-Western Lula da Silva and Modi took center stage. This was stated in Telegram by the head of the, I like this, Center for Countering Disinformation at the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine by Andriy Kovalenko. And we know Kovalenko is disinformation is probably the master of the disinformation campaign. But just unpack some of those, what I read to be utterly false and ridiculous statements or observations.
Well, let me just start off by saying, Wilmer, you can spin anything however you want to, any which way. So if you want it to go, if you want to say it was an utter failure, then you can find a way to do it. It's totally fine. That was not the view of those people on the ground. It definitely wasn't the view inside Brazil and of most people who were present. Like we mentioned, Putin didn't come because, he was afraid of an arrest warrant. Xi Jinping, from what I understand from many different analysts I've been speaking with, part of the reason why he declined to come. Now, he's built pretty good relations with Lula over just the last year, right? Like they've met. Lula went to China. He was in Brazil beforehand. So he was expected to arrive. And this was the first time that he and Putin did not come to one of these conferences. Now, remember that in the past, the BRICS, they were a much smaller event. It was only the 5 major leaders. We're not talking about 26 different countries. But as far as I understand, Xi Jinping, he didn't want to, so he knew that the final declaration was going to come out. And again, this is analysts. This is not me talking with him, but this is from what I've understood. He knew the final declaration was going to come out. He didn't want to be kind of involved in issues that are happening with Iran, Middle East, and he wanted to take a step back. And he didn't want to have to make statements that were very openly and clear. And he wanted to kind of play it on the DL for right now, on the down low. So that's what we understand about why he didn't come. We still don't really know. Now, there is press in Brazil that was talking about, oh no, it's because of the Brazilian first lady who made comments against China. It's like, again, it's the spin. However you want to spin it, you can spin it any which way. But at the bottom line, at the end of the day, it was a powerful conference, and so much came out of it. And although it was fascinating for me to see going into the conference, almost everyone's discourse around this on most mainstream press was like, oh well, the BRICS is happening, but Vladimir Putin's not going, and Xi Jinping, they're not going to be there. So it was like, oh, so it's not going to mean that much. In the end of the day, of course, Modi was there, and Lula was there, and a ton of other presidents were there. Now, what is fascinating is that we only heard, in terms of the statements, because Lula made his opening statements, and then all the rest of the presidents had 7 minutes to make their statements as well. We only heard Lula's. We weren't able to hear everybody else's. And then we saw their kind of final declarations. And this happened several different times around specific issues. One of those issues was around specifically artificial intelligence, which would be interesting to talk about in just a second. Okay. But at the end of the day, we don't know what a lot of those leaders said. We know what Putin said because that was then, I think it was shared online or whatever, televised, so that we heard what he said and we know what Lula said. But a lot of those other leaders, we won't know what they said. But of course, they were in agreement because they came out with their shared declarations. But at the end of the day, it was a really powerful summit, and it was like many people said, one of the most important BRICS summits that we've seen in a long time, and a summit I think that marks this year. Was
Wang Yi there, the foreign minister from China?
So most of the countries their foreign ministers were representing. Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. So and I asked that question because a lot of folks might not realize this. He wasn't there, but Wang Yi was there. And Putin wasn't there, but Lavrov was there.
Of course.
So if those two guys are in the room, then the people, I mean, you'd love to have Putin there. You'd love to have Xi there. But on the Chinese side, Okay, we know Putin didn't want to get involved in the ICC issue. Got that? Makes perfect sense. But another element that I'd love for you to respond to is the whole diplomacy aspect of this. And that when you look at Xi Jinping, he's a diplomat. Not only is he the president of his country, he is a trained diplomat. When you deal with Sergei Lavrov, he's been in the game 40 years. He's a trained diplomat. Marco Rubio is clueless. He can't spell diplomacy. You're bringing pea shooters to a gunfight when you start talking about Marco Rubio told Sergei Lavrov. Lavrov said, "Man, you," and the horse you rode in on. I mean, go ahead. I could go off on that one for an hour. Go
That's awesome. No, it's absolutely true. It's absolutely true. And also, let's not forget, Wilmer, that really, at the end of the day, the summit is really important because it brings everyone together.
Mm-hmm.
You get all the leaders in one room, they shake hands, you take pictures. Like it's a key moment. But everything they had to do to get to that point were the roughly 300 meetings that happened over the last year. And that's happening with representatives of all the different countries. That's been signed off from everybody, from every place. That's where the real negotiating is happening. So when you get to the summit, that was more clear than any other moment for me when they released the leaders' declaration at 2 or 3 in the afternoon on the very first day. Right? It was like, these guys have signed off on this, weeks ago, or not weeks ago because stuff has been happening, but like this is in the books already, and the summit is a key moment for people to come together. It's important. Like I said, the amount of press just to focus on this one specific day, people came in from everything. I'm talking to dozens of people from all these different countries who were there to cover this, was huge. And if those leaders weren't there, if you didn't have all these different countries, that just wouldn't have happened. But in terms of the negotiating, and in terms of like what they're coming out and the 126 different resolutions and what they want to do in the future, that's ongoing. It's an ongoing process. And it doesn't end with Rio on July 6th and 7th. Mm-hmm. It then begins again. Now they've got plans that are working and pushing towards COP30, because that's the biggest next event that's happening in Brazil. It's the big environmental event, which is huge. It's happening up in Belém in the Amazon. And that's Brazil's really focused on this. They want to bring everybody back. So they're trying to transition and making this connection from kind of the climate organizing and the climate resolutions that came out of the BRICS just now and in the negotiations we've had, and also looking toward COP30 that's going to be happening in November.
Was there any direct discussion about the latest developments with the Alliance of Sahel States and General Ibrahim Traore and what's going on with Burkina Faso and Niger? Were there any direct discussions about those issues taking place in Central Africa?
There may have been. Again, we didn't have access to almost any of the discussions that are happening. And of course, there's meetings between these countries and whatever else. But then the only people that we heard from was Lula and Putin in terms of like the leaders. And that was the other thing I was surprised of, is that a lot of these international events, at some point, usually there's some access for press to be able to liaison and communicate with the different delegations. I remember I was covering an OPEC conference in Venezuela in the 2000s, late 2000s. And they they gave all the press, you're like, okay, you've got a half hour and you're running around the room talking to the foreign ministers of all the different OPEC countries, with your recorder, just trying to get what you can. There was none of that. We were literally in different buildings. They were right next to each other. Mm-hmm. You could see the building over there. But, and then the only people who were allowed access to like the space when the leaders took their pictures and things like that were like the official press from the different countries themselves. It was a very closed press pool at that point. So that was the unfortunate thing about the event. I was hoping for more of a ability to grab people. In fact, for me, even just to get analysts, I had meetings set up beforehand, but like on the day of, when I realized what the situation was, then I had to kind of chase down different meetings. Then I met them out front, or if there were people inside, I can meet them there, because you need to have some sort of you don't just want to have you're packaging your stories with, here, Lula said these 5 things. You have to have some sort of analysis and different people speaking. So, that was the downside for me. I would have liked to have had more access and to be able to ask more questions like that, like you were just mentioning. So I don't doubt that it was mentioned, but we just don't have a way of knowing.
Unemployed Scholar, thank you for that $5 super sticker and the comment. The U.S. president praised William McKinley, tariffs and undisguised colonialism, but it means he's not equipped for 21st century geopolitics. Oh, you're absolutely right. When Trump talks about make America great again, he's waxing nostalgic. He's trying to take us backwards. He is not looking towards the future. Your thoughts, Michael Fox?
No, absolutely. It's so regressive. And again, it goes back to this question of why in the world where we're living today, why would you literally shoot yourself in the foot, destroy all means of communication and goodwill and relationships that you had, to then attack everybody and bully everybody? That's just going to make everybody try and run in the other direction. He is not equipped to be dealing in this world. It is impossible for his whole tariff thing to be successful. And yet he's pushing it, and he's going to continue to push it because that's who Trump is, but it's mind-boggling.
DTD, thank you very much for that $4.99 super sticker. Greatly appreciated. You mentioned Lula and Modi, and both of them, well, Lula, of course, is labeled in the West as being this incredibly left-wing liberal guy, which he is not. Modi, different dude, a very, very, very different guy. Which to have both of them kind of at the forefront of this particular summit, to me, is a clear indication of your point. This is less ideological and more practical business, trade, and economic driven, as opposed to ideological supremacy driven.
Well, absolutely. And I would say economically driven, but also politically, not in terms of right and left, but I would say in terms of pushing for a more multinational global governance system and trying to shake the balance of power with the EU and the United States and the West and whatnot. But absolutely, that's what's at the root of this. I think that's a really fascinating relationship to see those two up front. Now, I will say this, Wilmer. I will push back a little bit in terms of Lula, because what he represents for the Brazilian left traditionally, and of course, when we talk about Lula, and I've been saying this for 20 years, since the so-called pink tide of the 2000s. Mm-hmm. He was never revolutionary, and he was never socialism of the 21st century. He was not the Bolivia or the Chavez or the Evo Morales or the Rafael Correa or the Cuba. He was not them, but he was always willing to align with those countries, to back those countries in those moments when they needed it, to push back on Bush in those times and stuff. Now, so of course, he even wrote, before he was elected back in 2003 for his very first term, he wrote, the letter. What was it? The letter to the banks, or the letter to the economists, in which he said, "I'm not going to rock the boat. I'm not, that's you guys can be safe with me." And he's shown, that he's not going to do that. But in terms of the left, in terms of what he has represented, in terms of his victory against Bolsonaro, for instance, back in 2022, is huge. And he still is. If you ask anybody, like, who's the most important historic leader the left of the Brazilian left has ever seen, and unequivocally, everyone would say Lula.
I was more so referring to how he's been portrayed in Western media. That was really more. And you mentioned, and we have just a couple of more minutes. You mentioned AI. How did AI play into this?
Right. So this is really interesting. They spent an entire session just talking about AI and the importance of ensuring that AI is for everyone and AI is in the hands of every country, and is equally distributed. Everyone has access to AI and is not, specifically, Lula mentioned this on his speech, and is not in the hands and controlled by the billionaires, right? Because that's the direction it's going into. That's the direction it's been. And this is them really pushing back. So not only they came out with their 126 resolutions in their final declaration, they actually had their own specific declaration about AI, working together to ensure that there's equal access amongst the different countries, that it's used for good and not for evil, and it's not in the hands of, it's not top down, it's not in the hands of the few, it's in the hands of the many.
And final question for you. There's a growing concern about the weakening U.S. dollar, hyperinflation around the world as BRICS nations are moving away from dollar dominance. Was that discussed? Is that factored in to the dynamics here and the practical response for people globally that are finding themselves affected by this?
This is a great question. And there wasn't mention of, what's going to happen as we move toward our own local currencies, in part because there was a very specific focus on not mentioning the United States, not mentioning Trump, not mentioning the dollar. Like, they didn't use the word de-dollarization. They said we need to move towards our own local currencies. This is interesting. I think this is really important, interesting framing, because the whole idea is we're not going to get caught up in what's going to drag us down. We don't want to get caught up in Trump's deal, whatever else. We're going to focus on the positive, and we're going to keep focusing on the positive. So there was a very clear, you could see that in the declarations, you could see that in their kind of discourse. So what that meant, though, is there wasn't talk about what that could potentially mean if the dollar is used less on the international trade market, and then in terms is that going to cause hyperinflation? On that level of discussion, we didn't get into that. I mean, some things may have happened behind closed doors, but I doubt that they were getting on that level. It's much more on the pro-positive and on we need to support ourselves in terms of our own local currencies and whatnot. But yeah, it is a really interesting moment. Now, I will say also, Wilmer, this stuff is going to take time. As much as Putin would like there to be this international, by tomorrow everyone goes, check, and we've got our new SWIFT thing, but with the BRICS nations, and we're all dumping the dollar. It's going to take years to move in that direction.
Because they're talking about developing their own currency.
Of course. Or at least developing their own forms of their own SWIFT, their own ATM, like you mentioned earlier, right? That's, the currency would be far down, but if it's possible, I'm sure they would love to do it. Right? The more they can support each other at this level, at this horizontal, level of being able to trade on their own currency is incredible.
Michael Fox, man, thank you. Our first discussion, but man, I am looking forward to so many more. Really, really appreciate you giving me your time today and your analysis. And really, brother, look forward to having you back.
Thank you so much, Wilmer. It has been a pleasure. I look forward to the next time.
Thanks, man. Folks, thank you all for listening to the Connecting the Dots podcast with me, Dr. Wilmer Leon. New episode tomorrow. KJ No is going to join us. Follow and subscribe, leave a review, share the show. This is where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge, because as you all know, talk without analysis is just chatter, and we don't chatter here on Connecting the Dots. Why? Because this is rhetoric-free podcasting. See y'all tomorrow. KJ No. Until then, I am Wilmer Leon. Have a wonderful remainder of your day. Peace. I'm out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.